Welcome to today's panel, co-hosted by the delegation of the European Union to Canada and Canada's National Observer in partnership with the Department of Natural Resources Canada. I'm Linda Solomon-Wood, and I'm editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer, Canada's leading source for climate news. Today, we find ourselves in the middle of a sea change so big, it's actually hard to see it. What Bill Gates calls in his recent book, the biggest project human beings have ever done. Today, we consider how Canada and the European Union are together meeting this enormous challenge and the opportunities each country is exploring. Here with us to unpack this are Ditte Juul Jørgensen, the Director General for Energy at the European Commission. Ditte joins us from Brussels, and in Ottawa, Mollie Johnson, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Low Carbon Energy Sector with Natural Resources Canada. Ditte has been at the European Commission for nearly 3 decades and leads the Directorate General in its efforts to ensure access to affordable, secure, and clean energy. She is also driving Europe's process of becoming the first climate neutral continent. Mollie Johnson has served in a few positions at Natural Resources Canada, and she has held executive positions at Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Competition Bureau. Thank you both for being here. Before we dive into our interview, Ditte and Mollie both have opening remarks, and we'll hear first from Ditte.
Thank you very much, Linda, and very nice to see you, and nice to see you again, Mollie. Good morning to everyone over there from what is a lovely spring afternoon here in Brussels. I'm really delighted to be here. We've got such a good and close cooperation with Canada in the field of energy, as well as in many other areas, but in the field of energy. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to share that with you and to share some of our European experiences with you and talk about our cooperation in the field of climate and energy. So I'm very happy to be here together with Mollie and Natural Resources Canada. Linda, I thought I would just say a few words about where we are in Europe so that viewers have that context for what are our ambitions and what is the policy framework we have. We adopted a bit over a year ago what we call the European Green Deal, which essentially is a roadmap for how do we come to be climate neutral by 2050, and how do we do it in a way that supports our economic growth, our competitiveness, job creation. How do we make sure we do it in a way that is also just and fair for all Europeans and different European regions that come from different starting points. And because energy, both energy consumption and energy production, is such a significant share of our climate emissions, 75% in Europe, it's clear that energy policy and the energy transition are absolutely central to this pathway towards climate neutrality. And so we have a lot to do here on both increasing the share of renewable energy in the overall energy mix, of becoming more energy efficient, renovating our buildings for higher energy efficiency, but a number of other areas that I will be really happy to talk more about this morning with you and answer questions around that. It's clear that we in Europe cannot address the climate challenge alone. It's very much a global issue. We represent about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's an issue that requires global action and close cooperation with partners like Canada. So I look forward to talking more about that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ditte. Mollie?
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to the National Observer so much for having us. It's such a great opportunity to be here. So last week, my minister, Seamus O'Regan, he participated in a panel discussion, and it was part of the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue. One of the things that I noted was just the level of commonality and alignment between Canada and Europe's approaches to our energy transition and the climate objectives. I think it's something that we can all be really proud of. We're natural energy partners. Our goals are mutually reinforcing, and we're both committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Just a couple of examples. We agree that hydrogen is an essential component of meeting this target and that international collaboration is necessary to set the conditions for our success. We see the opportunity in using less power by tackling energy efficiency in our built environment. We understand that stability and predictability that comes with energy security and the need to harness the power of our private sectors is going to drive innovation. And on both sides of the Atlantic, we're investing in our people and our workers and our communities, and we're bringing their valued skills and expertise to drive the energy transition. And so with the collaboration and the methods of collaboration that are in place, like the high-level energy dialogue and the work that we're doing in multilateral platforms, we are very confidently able to tackle the many challenges that we have in front of us and the opportunities as well. And so with the, as we're recovering from the economic challenges that have been brought by COVID-19, our collaboration takes on even more importance. So global challenges like the ones we're facing, both the pandemic and climate change, they do require global solutions, as Ditte just said. And through our energy dialogue, we've established a true energy partnership that helps to forge these solutions. And this is a partnership that promotes the exchange of knowledge and best practices. It fosters trade and investment opportunities, and it encourages joint research. And it can help us both achieve our shared goals. So we're really pleased to be here as Natural Resources Canada, as the Government Canada, and to talk about the work that we're doing. I look forward to have a bit of a chance today to talk about the Strength and Climate Plan, some of the work that we're doing, but also what we're going to be able to achieve together under the climate plan, or under our HLED. So I'll pass it back over to you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mollie. And I want to let our audience know, I see our numbers are growing as we're speaking, and we're going to have about 25 minutes now, and I'm going to ask questions to Mollie and Ditte, and then we'll have time to go through questions from the audience. So first question for Ditte and Mollie, and this is for both of you. What are the key steps the European Union and Canada can take as transatlantic partners and global leaders on climate to accelerate action toward a clean energy transition?
Well, I think, first of all, what Mollie has just said in her introductory remarks, everything aligns completely with our agenda. So it's clear there's a very common transatlantic agenda, Canada, European Union on this, and I think that's the starting point. If I go through a couple of issues, I could speak for long about this, there are many examples, but if I just point to a couple of the key issues that we would see. The first is to set a clear goal, to have clear ambitions. Both Canada and the European Union have committed to climate neutrality in 2050, and that is what will drive a lot of our policy change over the coming years and where the energy sector has to contribute. If you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. And so I think that goal, that target, that clarity around our commitment to climate neutrality is essential for making progress. We have in the European Union also set a target for 2030 to make sure that we don't wait with everything until 2049. So for 2030, we're going to reduce climate or greenhouse gas emissions by 55%. The second thing I would point out from an EU-Canada perspective is that I think in each of our actions at home, but also in our cooperation, we can show what's possible. One of the things that's been essential in our European Green Deal, and Mollie, you mentioned it as well, the issue of people, jobs, just transition, bringing everyone on board. So it's essential is to show that you can reach climate neutrality, you can make a real change in the energy system, and at the same time create jobs and growth and strengthen our competitiveness, each of our leaderships in green technology. And I think showing that it can be done and showing it together will hopefully make it easier for others to take those steps, because they see, well, it doesn't go against an economic agenda. On the contrary, it can support growth and job creation and a fair transition. The third point I would say is that one important aspect of the cooperation, I think Mollie mentioned it as well, is the issue of innovation, technology, research and development. It's clear that we are going to need to improve both existing technologies and also find new technologies to help address the many challenges we have in the area of climate. And again, cooperation makes us better. So also in this field, I think there's a really interesting scope for cooperation and making progress both bilaterally, but of course also in the multilateral context. And the multilateral would be my last point here. I think when we speak not with a completely common voice, but when we push for the same overall agenda, the same overall level of ambition in the multilateral forum, we can really help move things also globally in the International Energy Agency, in the COP climate conference in November in Glasgow, at the UN High-Level Dialogue for Energy in September. There's a lot going on this year where I think Canada and EU together can really help move things forward.
Thank you. Mollie, would you like to address that?
This is going to be tough because there's a lot of alignment, and I really wish I could give you like a, oh no, not this kind of moment, but there's a lot of yes and that's going to be happening. So maybe I'll just add a couple of things. I would say one of my observations in the conversations that we've been having is the practical nature of our partnership with the European Union. So in the conversations that we've had within the framework of HLED, we've been very focused on what will lead to outcomes, what's the effective role of government, and how can we support creating the enabling frameworks that will help the energy transition be accelerated, but as Ditte was saying, in a way that supports people as they move through. So maybe just a couple of examples, like if we were to look, for example, at hydrogen or EVs or batteries or any of those things, like there's a lot of work that has to be done in terms of like codes and standards, or the real, like not super sexy and exciting, but real function of government work that has to get done together in multilateral fora and international partnership. And those are going to create the conditions of success so that we can have functioning, effective global trade as we're building a low carbon economy. And so I think, you know, as we're trying to cooperate, what we can do together is, you know, set up those practical milestones so that we can accelerate the work that is going to be happening together. And then again, just to sort of come back to the people side of it, I think as we're looking at the future economy, we really want to make sure that we are bringing all of the people along with us in that transition. And so I think, you know, from Canada's perspective, we have a huge opportunity to be bringing, you know, to change the composition of our energy sector so that it is reflective of all the people of Canada, to include racialized, Indigenous, women, like all of those people into our sector and bring their perspectives and their skills there as well. And I think that's part of what our opportunity is as we're moving through in the transition. So I just add those things on.
And Mollie, what role does the high-level energy dialogue play in that?
I mean, what we're really benefiting from is sharing each other's experiences. So in some cases, like the European Union is ahead of us in some of the work. In some cases, we've been doing things that they haven't been doing. And so particularly in the context of the pandemic, we have not had the opportunity to sort of go into each other's backyard and take a look at what's going on. And I would share, I think my last meeting before the pandemic was under the framework of the high-level dialogue, and it was an energy efficiency meeting that we had, and then everything closed and I was supposed to head over. But what we're able to do is sit down and say, okay, so we're trying to do this. Does it work? How's it worked for you? Just transition was one of the conversations that we had. And you know, understanding how people respond to just transition. It doesn't resonate with everybody. And so we need to talk about what the right language is, how we support people in upskilling and looking at those opportunities. And that is an experience that our colleagues in the European Union have had as well, and that we can also share with our colleagues in other jurisdictions. So it helps us, you know, ground truth, the experiences that we're having in our countries.
Ditte, how about you? Can you comment on the high-level energy dialogue and the role that you believe that it is going to play?
Yes, I would be happy to do that, Linda. And again, unfortunately, really agreeing on everything. So no very exciting conflicts at all. Because I think what Mollie has put really very, very well, that as part of the high-level energy dialogue, we really aim to exchange experience. We aim to be operational and practical. Really look at what needs to be done on the ground. What experiences have we each gained in what we do? To link into what Mollie also said about the current context and recovery, one of the things we are looking at here is how to recover the economy after this 1 year of COVID crisis and lockdown, which has had a really significant impact on our economy, like on the global economy. And we have launched a recovery program called Next Generation EU, and we have agreed to all European member states have committed to spending 37% of those recovery-related investment on climate positive investments. So on renovation of buildings, on powering up, investing in the clean energy generation, renewable energy generation in particular, investing in hydrogen, and so we are currently looking at national recovery and resilience plans from our member states, where they each set out within this Next Generation EU, how will they invest? How will they arrive at this 37% at least of climate-related investments? What sectors will it go to? How will it help them recover economically while moving towards the climate targets? And so because we are all in the same boat, in the sense we want to address the climate challenge, we want to do that decisively and ambitiously, and we want to recover. We want to make sure that we get out of this economic crisis and that everybody is is brought in, that no one is left behind in either of these processes. So because we are at exactly that same moment, facing the same significant challenges, it's a great time to actually exchange and look at how have you done it? Is there something we can learn? I think two more points, if I may. One is the whole aspect of investment trade, the whole economic aspect of both of recovery, but also of climate. There's a lot of opportunities here for developing technologies, green technologies, and for creating jobs and growth. In addition to our close cooperation on energy, we have a strong trade agreement, the CETA agreement, that has created a lot of new opportunities, also in the sector of green technology and energy efficiency. So I think there's really scope to work within that broader framework between Canada and the European Union. And then the second point I wanted to make here is that of just transition. We see across Europe, different countries or different regions, to be more precise, have quite a different energy mix and are in different situations. To give you an example, one of our member states still has a number of coal regions and uses about 70% coal in its electricity mix. And so it's clear for those specific regions that have a very high share of coal in the electricity generation, the step into a green and clean energy system is a more significant one, and it has the potential of having more having difficult socioeconomic consequences that we need to help address to create new jobs, to help build the skills to move into different types of technology. And that's happening. Whereas for other member states, the transition has already happened to some extent. So the issue of just transition is one that's really central to our Green Deal. And I hear the same from Mollie in terms of Canada. And I think it's a good example of an area where sharing experience can really help us on both sides.
And where is it in Europe that who's still dependent on coal? Which country?
The country that has 70% of coal in its electricity mix is Poland, and there are several regions in Poland that really are dependent on coal. At the same time, Poland is investing in offshore renewable energy, in onshore wind and solar. They have just doubled their share of photovoltaic in their energy mix over a very short period of time. So a lot is happening there. They have really interesting plans for some of these coal regions, for example, to step to change the skills and the industrial structure in these regions from coal-related activities to, for example, battery production, for clean mobility, for city buses that will be electric. So a significant shift in the energy system, but also in everything that's related to that, in the industrial base, in the jobs, in the skills that are needed. So quite ambitious and interesting agendas. And what we can do at European level is to work on coal regions in transition. We provide support for that, and we have a just transition facility to help. What's been quite interesting to see at global level is that other countries have emulated that coal regions in transition initiative and the just transition facility, so as to try to go through similar changes that are needed for them in their countries.
Mollie, you spoke about the significant opportunities provided by the energy transition for North America and Europe. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives, well, both of you, on the favorable conditions needed to make it happen, including, as you're mentioning, attracting investments and ensuring that we have the right workplace in force. Mollie, could you speak to that first?
From the investment attraction perspective and sort of from the Canadian perspective, I think there's a couple of things. Canada has a strong record of being sort of a stable, reliable democracy with a good record for investment attraction. And I think, we've got vast natural resources and we're known for that. I think what's really important right now is the fact that we have got a climate plan, the Strengthened Climate Plan, that is achievable, and it's achievable plan focused on emissions reduction that is going to get us to where we want to be, exceeding our targets by 2030. And that includes a number of measures that are going to support with industrial decarbonization. It's going to help us use less energy, like all sorts of measures there. And why is that important right now and not something that is just sort of an additional burden, as we perhaps would have seen 5 to 7 years ago in terms of the language? I think, what's really changed over the past, and it's happening quickly, is that 18 months or 2 years, is that markets are increasingly pricing in climate. And so when we look at at companies wanting to make investments, and countries wanting to support their companies in those business to business relationships and making investments, they are increasingly valuing the ESG framework. And so I look at Canada, I look at things like the Impact Assessment Act, where we have, the government has put up front those Indigenous consultations. We're able to understand sort of what the issues are around projects. Like, all of those changes are creating a more predictable and certain environment that support businesses in having those ESG metrics quite strong. So from my perspective, I think that there is those are all the things that are going to support long-term stable investment attraction. From the workforce perspective, I mean, I think we've got the universities, we've got all of those elements that we are continuing to work. Our colleagues at ESDC are quite focused on the skills from the future agenda. And I think that's something that will be continuing to come forward, but that's going to be a key component as well as we're building up the skills for the future for the low carbon transition. So maybe I'll just pause there.
Ditte,
Yes, thank you. I think a number of these points are relevant also from a European perspective. I would say we need to make sure that there is predictability both in the investment climate, but also in the political environment. And there, once again, the fact that we have set long-term targets, that we've got targets for 2030, we're discussing, well, what about 2040? It means that investors will know what is the environment they're working in. This is not going to change. This is a given. We are on the path towards climate neutrality in 2050. This is in Europe agreed by all 27 heads of state and government. So this is set. So I think that's the first point that is extremely interesting. In addition to that, of course, the overall stability of the political environment, the context is important as well. Then we've got the regulatory side of things, and that's where we at European level and the European Commission have a significant responsibility in making sure that we have the right regulatory framework in place that can allow for the investments to go in the direction that will be part of the transition. So more investments into renewable, more investments into the grid, because we're going to need a higher level of electrification in the energy system in order to become climate neutral. Investment into new technologies, hydrogen, green hydrogen in particular, is a really important part of the future energy system, is necessary really to become climate neutral, certainly in Europe. And yet it's one of these technologies that there's not yet a real market. So how do we best regulate at this point in time, making sure that there's room for a market to develop, that there's room for both supply and demand to develop and go in the direction of green hydrogen rather than other forms of hydrogen. So the regulatory clarity and stability is really important. What we're working at now very concretely is a package that we call Fit for 55, which is a really ambitious climate and energy package of legislative proposals that we will be putting forward in the summer for our European Parliament and our member states to look at and adopt. And essentially what you can see is this in this package is that all sectors are part of it. You need to look at what do you do in the field of transport fuel, aviation and maritime, what do you do in the field of energy, as I've already mentioned, what do we do with our emissions trading scheme, our land use change rules, our effort sharing among member states. There's no sector of the economy that cannot contribute. We need all sectors, so agriculture, industry, and that's what we're working at the moment, at setting a coherent overall regulatory framework that facilitates these investments and helps set the right framework for this to happen in the coming years. So quite an ambitious and interesting agenda.
And how will the high-level energy dialogue partnership facilitate that, both in Canada and Europe? Ditte, can you start?
Yes, I mean, I think there are many areas, because our high-level energy dialogue really covers all the areas that both Mollie and I have been touching upon. But to take just one example, I think for all of us, we know that we need to be more energy efficient. We need to green and clean the energy we consume, but we need to lower our consumption as well. Otherwise, it will be impossible to reach the climate neutrality target. What we have in Europe is a principle called energy efficiency first. So when we do policy, when we take action, we start by saying, can we lower our consumption? And then for the consumption that remains, we need to make sure that's a green consumption or on the basis of green energy. A very important part of energy efficiency is the renovation of buildings. We have launched a renovation wave to try to double the rate of renovation of buildings because that's the most important sector when it comes to energy consumption. I think it's about 40% of our energy consumption in Europe and 36% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So really something that could change. We are in this renovation wave, which looks at investments, looks at creating the right regulatory framework, looking at what are the standards, what are the requirements we have, how do we address the fact that price elasticity is low in many sectors, in rented buildings, for example, if you live for rent, how do we then help that happen? I know that you in Canada as well are looking at the built environment and lowering emissions from the built environment. So we are at a time where we are facing similar challenges, different local contexts, but nonetheless very similar challenges, and where I think some of these exchanges can really help us on both sides. Another aspect related again to energy efficiency and renovation is the skills. We have adopted a skills agenda in Europe to look at how do we make sure we have the green skills. And here, building renovation is a sector that is very job intensive. That's a good thing. We can create jobs and growth and very local jobs typically. So we need to make sure we have the skills to do that. And again, I think here it's really interesting to exchange and hear, can we learn from each other? Is there something we can do together? And maybe just one last point on this, one last example is that of technology. Again, we have different technologies, different solutions. We can benefit from each other, both in a sense of making use of each other's technologies, learning from them, but again, also in a trade and investment context, this is of great interest to both of us, I think.
Thank you. Mollie?
First of all, what I would say is I think we could probably use some branding help from the European Union. As I hear Fit for 55 and Renovation Wave, they're the best names. You guys have such good names. But maybe just some practical examples of things that we can do or that we are doing. I mean, in terms of sort of the structure of the agreement that we operate under, we have sort of 5 main areas that we cooperate under. There's research and development, there's energy systems integration. We also are focused together, as Ditte was just saying, in terms of our energy efficiency, our power supply, and then our energy policy and planning. But, you know, I think one area that just to sort of drill down for a second is in the area of emerging renewables. And so we've had a program that we've been running here in Canada called, I always get this acronym wrong, the Emerging Renewable Power Plan. That's it, ERPP. And it's a great program where we've been able to, as government, help bring in technologies that have been used elsewhere in the world but new to Canada and demonstrate them here. And in many cases, those are technologies that have been used in Europe before. So again, it's sort of building like what's working elsewhere, how can we demonstrate them in Canada, and then how could we look at the opportunities to upscale those. So those become sort of very practical opportunities for us to, look at what's happening elsewhere and then try and embed those technologies to bring more clean power onto our system. So it's just part of the way that we're trying to make it very practical cooperation.
Mollie, Canada has recently announced a climate change plan, including a commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050, as you've mentioned, a target your government is in the process of legislating. At the same time, Canada is a major energy producing country that continues to export various types of energy globally. How does Canada reconcile these two seemingly contradictory positions?
That is always the question that we get in our conversations. But I think, it's an energy transition. It's not an energy stop and change. And if we look at, the modeling that comes out of the International Energy Agency, or if we look at demand, the world is going to continue to need traditional energy sources for a number of years. And, even sort of going back to our trade with the European Union under CETA, I think over the first 2 years, our energy trade went up about 106%. So, it bears out that we are continuing to exchange in what is a big part of Canada's GDP in our traditional energy sector. I spoke a little bit earlier about the fact, though, that through the investments in the Strength and Climate Plan, like all large industrial emitters, Canada is focused on reducing their emissions intensity. And that's led by things like using our hydropower to bring more clean electricity to facilities, looking at opportunities to increase industrial energy efficiency, taking every step that you can to drive down emissions. So what we are producing as Canada is less emissions intensive. And then at the same time, continuing to invest in and provide opportunities for the emergence of our and growth of our, of clean fuels, of increased electricity, and then also using less power. So we're pursuing those pathways as well. So I think, from Canada's perspective, we know where we want to go. We know that we are constantly on a trajectory to reduce our emissions, and we have lots of opportunity, but we also want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that maintains Canada's long-term interests going forward.
The European Green Deal contains, it's full of energy relevant policies. Could you please describe these areas and what they mean for stronger cooperation between the EU and Canada that's related to those policies?
I've mentioned some of them. I've mentioned energy efficiency renovation, so I will leave that one aside here. There are many, so let me point to a couple of other examples. Now, one is renewable energy, where we are going to need to have a much higher level of renewable energy in the system, and we're going to need to see a more electrified energy system. One of the things we have assessed is that in order for us to change the energy system to support the climate neutrality target, the system needs to be much more integrated. We've traditionally had a system where you've had electricity going into some uses, gas or fuels into other uses, or fuels into transport, and these different parts of the system don't actually talk to each other. And that means that there's quite a lot of waste in the system. To give you a very concrete example of waste in the system, you could have excess heat from industrial processes, excess heat from data centers, which are extremely energy intensive and where the heat just, in many cases, simply disappear out into the system. That heat is energy. So we need to make use of that by binding the different pieces of the energy system together. So an absolutely central piece in our energy contribution to the climate target is to help build a more integrated energy system, one that is circular, where the different pieces talk to each other, one where we make better use of storage. And again, to give you a concrete example, more and more people have electric vehicles. These electric vehicles have batteries that help the vehicles move, but these batteries can also be used as a storage facility for the wider energy system, for the wider grid, if we plan that well. So we need smart grids and consumers that will be enabled to make use of these things for cheaper and greener energy. So this integrated energy system is really at the center of what we do for a cleaner, more electrified, more renewable and circular system, where again we use all these waste sources and put them back into the system. There are I think that's at the center, and hydrogen is a key point of that, because the sectors that are hard to abate, you've got industrial sectors that you can't just electrify. It would be too expensive or impractical. And so where they can't be electrified, clean hydrogen, and here I mean green hydrogen produced on the basis of renewable electricity with electrolyzers and then becoming hydrogen, that green hydrogen can help these industrial processes decarbonize. Otherwise, it would be difficult. So that's a really central part of our overall energy planning as part of this, as part of the climate neutrality. Then we need to recognize that we still have significant levels of fossil in our system. And how do we make sure that we decarbonize? How do we decarbonize that? But also, how do we make sure that we can lower as much as possible methane emissions linked to this fossil is another key point that we're looking at. So we have launched a strategy around the reduction of methane emissions linked to energy, but also to other sectors, where we will both try to regulate within Europe to lower these levels, to set some requirements for what is possible, but where we're also completely dependent on international cooperation and on energy exporting countries like Canada to address this, because of course most of the emissions of methane from the energy system comes from countries that are energy producers. And again, to come back to our cooperation between Canada and the EU, Canada is an energy producer. We are a significant importer of energy. And so it's quite interesting to look at this from the different parts of the system and see, well, how do we then make that work together? And there, I think that complementarity is really an important part of the cooperation. Once again, an important part of our broader agenda towards climate neutrality. I think I'll stop there, Linda. There's so many energy aspects in this climate work, so I could, go on forever, but happy to answer more questions.
Okay, and we have some great questions from the audience, so I'd like to move to that now. And I'm going to start with a question from Brian Beaton. He's asking you, Ditte, will you discuss why the European Union identified nuclear energy as not a green and clean energy?
Thank you. It's such a good question, and one that we're really grappling with. How do we best define it? I should be clear, we have not defined it as not being green and clean. The jury is still out on exactly how do we define it. So let me give you a few points of context first. Within the European Union, it's up to each member state to set its own national energy mix. And about half of European member states have nuclear power as part of that energy mix, and the other half doesn't. And that's each of their decision. At European level, at the common level, we have a treaty that gives us, the European Commission, me, a role in terms of ensuring safeguards and nuclear safety. But the cooperation doesn't go much further than that. It's a national choice. Secondly, we have in our analysis towards how do we become climate neutral in 2050, how do we achieve the 2030 targets, in that analysis, we can see that we need nuclear to get there. So in the 2050 analysis, we see that the share of nuclear energy in the European energy system towards a climate neutral 2050 should stay more or less unchanged, so around 15% with this with an uneven share from member state to member state, but more or less an unchanged level. So in other words, our analysis shows you actually need nuclear to get there because nuclear is a carbon neutral energy source. There are many other issues and discussions around nuclear, but from a carbon and emission perspective, it's clear that it's a neutral energy source. And so in other words, we see it as a necessary part of the overall European energy mix to achieve climate neutrality, but it's for each member state to decide if they will continue with nuclear or go into nuclear, and there are different national decisions there. One member state is stepping out of nuclear, other member states are looking to step into nuclear because they see that as a necessary, stable baseload of power in their system towards climate neutrality. Finally, what we're looking at the moment, I think that's probably what the question refers to, is a taxonomy for sustainable investment. So as to create transparency and clarity for investors when they invest, when can they say it's green? And the objective of that is to have clarity and to avoid greenwashing, of course. And in that context, there is a discussion around nuclear, but that is still ongoing. In order to create more clarity on that, we have launched actually a research report, an analytical report to make sure that we take well-informed and fact-based decisions. So we're still looking at what exactly will that look like in future.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question to that, I'm really interested to know, well, this is a question actually from Allison Patton in the audience. And Allison is saying, very interested to know what's being planned and discussed regarding nuclear power. I think this refers to Canada. I'm very concerned about it. And, you know, as a follow-up to that, what is nuclear's role in the energy transition? Mollie, I'll start with you. What's being discussed in terms of nuclear power in Canada and its role in net zero?
Absolutely. Thanks very much. So I think, you know, one of the things the International Energy Agency has told us is that we only have about 25% of the technologies that we need in order to get to net zero. And, you know, so when we look at that, and you know, there was a report that was done by, I'm so bad at acronyms, I should not be a government employee, but it's, I think, the Climate Center for Choices. Anyway, I will get back to you and we can share it out afterwards, but it was a great report, and it was on sort of the safe bets and the wild cards. But then when they were looking at the sort of the technologies that we need to be looking at in Canada in terms of getting to net zero as well, SMRs, small modular reactors, were part of that mix. And it is on the basis, as Ditte was saying, is that these are low emitting technologies and stable baseload power sources that can support, you know, sort of bringing on more renewables, bringing on, you know, those, you know, that stable, provide that stable baseload that we could need to support a low emitting power sector. I would say a couple of things though. In Canada, we are absolutely looking at small modular reactors. We are looking at, though at the same time, we have a consultation ongoing right now on our radioactive waste policy, and that is considering our policy today, but also considering the framework that we're going to need over the longer term. So we see those two things as needing to work together, and we need to make sure that we're preparing ourselves for our landscape, contemplating what the future of nuclear looks like. And we're working with all of our partners in doing that and considering best practices. So bottom line, it's part of the mix because we've got to have all of the options on the table as we're moving forward. And maybe just as a final piece for folks who are interested in what the path forward looks like, I think it was in December that we released the SMR action plan. And that really does set out not just what Canada is contemplating, but also what provinces, companies, Indigenous communities, women in nuclear, skills, like universities. It's sort of that community of nuclear community in Canada is contemplating for the future in nuclear. And it would be a good source to check out.
One of the things I just want to bookmark about what you just said, I believe I heard you correctly, is that Canada only has 25% of the technology necessary to meet its 2050 targets.
That would be the world, not Canada. So internationally. And so what that statistic is really saying is that innovation, research and development is fundamental to the international community's ability to get to where we're going. And that is on one hand kind of like yikes, on the other hand, what an opportunity, because we know that sort of the innovation is part of, and human ingenuity is part of how we're going to achieve where we're going.
Thank you. Ditte, we have a lot of questions coming in for you about the transition to hydrogen, but also Mollie, for you. So we'll start with you, Ditte. John Mickelson says, Europe is well ahead of Canada on the transition to hydrogen. How can Canada, well, let's just start with you, Ditte. Can you tell us a little bit about Europe and the transition to hydrogen? And I think for a lot of us, hydrogen is a new thing, a new energy source to think about. And can you explain a little bit about how Europe is using it and what its role is proportionally in?
Yes, I would be very happy to do that. And indeed, hydrogen in the European energy system now is insignificant. It's a very, very small share. The hydrogen that's in the system currently is what we would call gray hydrogen, so fossil-based and full of carbon. And it really goes into as industrial feedstock, into various industrial processes. So right now we're not there. But what we see is that in order to achieve our emission reductions by 2030 and beyond that, we need hydrogen as an energy carrier, as a storage of energy. It's not an energy source in itself, but it is going to be a necessary energy carrier in the system, because it could allow us to integrate much higher levels of green power, so renewably produced electricity, into the system via electrolyzers, and thereby creating gases, fuels that can be used for various industrial processes. So a necessary component, kind of a missing link in our integrated green energy system. And we launched a strategy around energy just last year, around hydrogen just last year at European level, and then a number of our member states have local or national strategies for how to get there. Maybe just a couple of general points around that. First of all, what we see is we're going to need very significant investments. We're going to need very significant investments in large renewable electricity generation, and that will primarily have to be offshore wind, because that's where you can really scale up to the level that's needed, or very large photovoltaic, so solar energy parks, again, to get to the levels that are needed. Then you're going to need very significant investments into electrolyzers. And this is a good example of a technology that we have, but it's still in the early stages. So we're going to need to develop that much more to, again, get to the scale that is needed. So research and development and significant investments there as well. Then hydrogen is a useful energy carrier, again, because you can transform the electricity, so the electrons, into molecules, essentially what is needed in a number of industrial processes and other uses, large-scale transport, aviation, and maritime potentially. So you need it as part of that, but it's also a fairly expensive source. And so you really need to think about what's the best use for hydrogen, because there are some applications where it would be cheaper and simpler simply to electrify. To give you one possible example, it would be heating and cooling, where heat pumps now are so energy efficient that's actually quite a good solution for some of those uses. But again, as I said before, there are some industrial processes where you can't really electrify, or we don't have the technology to do it, or it's too expensive or too energy intensive. And that's where hydrogen comes in. So a lot of investment is needed. I think a lot of analysis, both on the supply and demand side, and then a lot of planning as well. What some of our member states are looking at is to actually build man-made new islands that didn't exist before. And these islands will be energy islands that combine large scale offshore wind energy with electrolyzer capacity. And they would then link into different member states from their location in the North Sea and help bring the hydrogen there.
And Ditte, are Canada and the EU collaborating on hydrogen fission development? And either one of you could take that question.
Well, I think on hydrogen, we need to work internationally, because it's not just Europe that needs the hydrogen market, or Canada or other countries. We need to make sure that there is a genuine global market, or at least the conditions for a global market are there, so that we can have the cheapest and greenest hydrogen. And that requires us to talk about standards, certification, what's green hydrogen, and really to look at all the different elements of a global market. So that requires us to work closely together.
Back to buildings. Fatima Kirar asks, what can Canada learn from the European Union on how we can speed up the retrofitting of buildings?
Lots. I mean, I think we are just about to embark on, as we've announced in Canada, our home retrofit program. And so that came out, I think it was in the FES, again, acronym that I'm horrible with, but in the government's update in November. And so, you know, I think as we've been developing that, have been speaking with our colleagues in the European Union to get a sense of what is working and what's not working in the context of their renovation wave. I think, you know, our sort of, we're thinking about a number of things with buildings. How do we sort of crowd in capital, and what is the opportunity for us to do in sort of the commercial and built environment? We've already seen some investments by the Canadian Infrastructure Bank into the building space. So that is sort of one of the lessons learned that we've been able to see. I think in the home retrofit space, also looking at supply chains and the opportunities there and what we might be able to do as we're continuing to move forward. So lots of opportunities, and not just for today, but tomorrow. And it's an area that our working groups are continuing to collaborate on.
I have a question now from Zulina Alsa Wajne. What is the gap in Canada's policy that makes it fall behind the European Union in adapting low carbon vehicles? Mollie, if you could quickly address that. And maybe Ditte has insight as well.
You know what? I'm not going to be able to answer that one. The leadership on zero emission vehicles doesn't fall with our department. Okay,
Ditte, do you have any insights on that?
Well, I can't speak to Canadian policy on this. What I can see is that we are looking at this intensely in Europe as well. And there are a number of challenges just of a practical nature. So, for example, to go to clean mobility, we're going to need a significant infrastructure investment into charging stations for vehicles, for example. Some member states in Europe are quite far on that and have relatively high shares of electric vehicles, but for others, we still need investments. One of the things we hope to do is that as part of this next generation recovery plan that I mentioned before, to incentivize member states to invest in this infrastructure to get it going. If there's no infrastructure, nobody's going to want to buy an electric car. So we need that.
Osbjorn Midjord asks, how important do the panelists think a carbon tariff on important goods is in the global energy transition? Ditte?
So from a European perspective, we apply our emissions trading scheme to industrial processes, across the European economy, and we're currently looking at, do we need to extend this? At a global level, what we see is that if we take this action, but others don't, there's a risk of carbon leakage. There is a risk that energy intensive production goes where the carbon is cheaper, so to say. And that's a climate concern, because that means at global level, we will not be lowering emissions. It's just going to move around. And that's what we need to address. So one of the instruments we are looking at and we're considering analyzing is indeed a carbon border adjustment measure, which would apply ETS, to simplify, which would apply this emissions trading scheme also to imported goods to make sure that we can limit carbon leakage. And so I think this is a discussion, it's an issue for discussion with our trading partners and with our partners in general, where we need to see, well, what does it mean globally?
Okay, thank you. Excellent question from Fiona McMurran, and it's been on my mind as well to ask, what is the Canadian government's plan to renew and extend the electricity grid? Mollie.
Thank you. So lots of work underway. Regionally, we are looking at interties. We are looking at the Atlantic Loop. So there's an opportunity there to extend clean power throughout the Atlantic region, with the recognition that it is advantageous for us to move the power through the region. Also in British Columbia, for example, looking at interties there as well to sort of pull a battery over to the jurisdictions that don't have hydropower to support them in strengthening that grid.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I have a question here from Noel Key, and then I'm going to ask one more question, and that will take us to the end of our hour. Noel Key asks, does Canada have good stats on relative investments in nuclear, hydrogen, wind, solar, and fossil fuels?
I am sure that we do. I just don't have them on hand right now. So I think I can get back to our colleagues at the National Observer. We do have the Energy Fact Book, which Natural Resources Canada does have online. So I would suggest perhaps that might be the best place, or with our colleagues at Statistics Canada. There's also the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, which is a partnership between Natural Resources Canada and StatsCan, who also house information on our energy information. So I would suggest actually that those would be the places to check out.
Lots of questions still coming in, but I think this is one that many people have on their minds. It's Ken Patton asks, what do the representatives make of the 2050 targets, considering the statements regarding action over the next 10 years of the science-based United Nations Declaration? In other words, is 2050 soon enough?
We need to have this clear target for 2050. As I said, if we don't know where we're going, we're never going to arrive there. At the same time, if we were to just say 2050 and backload everything, then it's certainly not sufficient. It's sufficient if you have the right trajectory to get there, and that's why we are setting these targets for 2030. And member states have, our 27 member states each have a national plan for how to get to the 2030 targets and beyond there. So I think it's important to have the long-term goal, but also to have these milestones so that we make sure we get there in the right pace and do as much as possible, as early as possible, for a real effect on climate and greenhouse gas emissions.
And I would double down on that, just to say, like, we need to be practical and we need to be achievable. And so if we want it, we can't just think about the end goal and expect it to happen. We need to put in the work every month, every 2 months, every year, and every day. And so I think that's really what we're focused on, what the European Union is focused on. And, we're delivering very practical plans. So.
Okay, we have time for another question. This has come from Dennis Chaptiani. Sorry, Dennis, I probably just didn't pronounce your name right. Has cap and trade been more or less effective than a carbon tax when looking at discouraging the use of fossil fuels?
I wouldn't be able to give a comparison between different types of pricing instruments. I can say what we have learned in Europe and what our assessments for the future show is that you're going to need a combination of pricing instruments. So for us, it's the emission trading system, and in some parts it's a carbon tax, the energy taxation system, and a regulatory framework to make sure that we also incentivize investments and behavior in the right direction. Otherwise, you risk just shifting the energy consumption or the energy generation from one source to another. That's not the idea. So I think you're going to need a combination of pricing instruments and the right regulatory tools and investments.
Richard Townell asks, how are the European Union and Canada measuring climate progress and results? And we'll end on this. So Mollie, we'll start with you, and then we'll end with you, Ditte.
I think our results are, and we're both committed to, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues in the European Union, but under the UNFCCC framework, we provide our results, as all countries do, on where we are in terms of megatons and those pieces. I would also say, the government of Canada also views our Strength and Climate Plan as an economic plan, as a jobs plan. And so I think as well, the results will be in the opportunities that we have to create jobs and to grow a new and prosperous economy for Canadians. So I think those are sort of the two indicators. But from a climate perspective, the objective is to see delivering results through the UNFCCC framework.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you to everyone for the really interesting questions and the great discussion, Mollie. So also at European level, exactly that, we use the international framework, the UNFCCC, for the measurements. In addition to that, We've built, as I mentioned before, a system of national energy and climate plans so that we can also do so we can look at all the smaller steps. Where is each member state in their energy and climate planning? What are the actions they will take, and are they on track to take them? And at European level, looking at, as I said, creating the energy system, the integrated energy system that can help us get there. So I think we are assessing it and monitoring this at many different levels at the same time. So it's quite a complex exercise to make sure we've got all the right things in place.
Ditte, Mollie, thank you so much for being here with us this morning in Canada. We've gone over such interesting topics this morning: the race against climate change, hydrogen, nuclear energy, the electric grid. We've only been able to touch on them. I look forward to future conversations and exploring much more of this together. For those of you listening in, I'm Linda Solomon Wood. Today's episode was co-organized by the European Union and National Observer and Natural Resources Canada, and produced by our amazing team at Canadian Centre for Journalism. I'd like to give a shout out to our producer, Shadayer Tashvidi, and colleagues Janelle Johnson, Jenny Uechi, and Yamina Salamlal for their help on this event. Have a great day, everyone. See you next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Ditte.